in the book of Ruth, and we began it last week. I described it last week as the Hallmark movie of the Old Testament. It's 4 little short chapters, not very long at all. But in these 4 chapters, you get all of this drama taking place. It begins with just really tragedy, like most Hallmark movies do, you know. I mean, if you ever watched a Hallmark movie, here's a girl, and she's having to come back home because, you know, her father's died, and there's nobody to run the ranch anymore, and she's in New York trying to be a lawyer, but now she's got to go back and run the farm, and you know, you think, wow, what a terrible story. And then, of course, all at once, you know, Prince Charming shows up, and everything ends happily ever after, right? Well, there's more to Ruth than that, but in many ways, that is the story of the book of Ruth. And last week we began by looking at the first 3 verses very quickly. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live a while in the country of Moab. Now, this is the second generation of people that have come into the land of Canaan. We know that from the fact that Boaz is the son of Rahab, who was the prostitute that Tim mentioned in the devotional a while ago, that was, you know, a part of Jericho at the time. So we can actually date the story within just a few years. And so it's the second generation, and there's a famine that showed up. And one of the things last week I mentioned was the fact that God had warned Israel, you turn your back on me, and I'm going to get your attention. I may get it with pestilence. I may get it with another nation subjugating you. I may get it from famine. But I'm going to get your attention. And so it's very likely that this famine that hits Israel at this time is because they're turning their back on God. And what happens is this family, the man's name is Elimelech, which means my God is king. His wife's Naomi, 2 sons are Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, okay? I mean, they're people who have been giving a part of the land as Joshua divided the land up. They've got their land in Bethlehem. And what do they do when the first famine strikes? They leave the land. I mean, knowing what God had promised through Moses, instead of the one who says, my God is king, and relying upon him, he says, family, it's time to move. And they head to Moab. And of course, when they get over to Moab, Elimelech dies. And all at once, Naomi's left with her 2 sons. Now, we know in the text, and we're going to see this, they lived there for 10 years. Okay, there's a 10-year span. And so when they go into the land, their 2 sons are very likely somewhere in their, you know, maybe mid-teens, maybe late teens. And now Dad's gone. And so the question is, okay, now what's going to happen? And what you see happening is once again, now again, the story's going to end well. But it ends well simply because God is working through the story. And that's one of the points that we've made in multiple lessons, is that even when we make bad choices, if we're part of God's plan, He works through even our bad choices to accomplish His will. And so we need to understand that. And so notice the next bad mistake that they make. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. Now, because we know who Ruth is, we're like, that's not bad. Ruth is a wonderful person. But you need to realize, not when they get married. She's a Moabite. And you go, okay, what's the problem with being a Moabite? And the problem is that God had warned the Israelites, be careful when you go into the land. Not to give your sons to the people of the land's daughters or your daughters to their sons. Don't do that. Because if you choose to marry, do not underestimate the importance of whom you marry. I cannot emphasize this lesson enough. I mean, who we marry, if we choose to marry, is going to affect the rest of our lives. Now, how they married back then and how we marry today was vastly different. Back then, marriages were arranged marriages. In other words, your dad got together with someone else in the community and began to negotiate and, for this price, I'll take your daughter for a wife for my son, or for this price, I'll give my daughter to your son. I mean, they were prearranged marriages. And it worked for thousands of years. I'm glad they gave up on it a few generations ago, right? Because as much as I loved my mom and dad, I would not want my mom involved in who I married. I mean, when I was in high school, Mother would say, that's a pretty girl right there. And I'd go, Mom, man alive. By the way, she wasn't pointing at June, okay? Just to make sure things are clear. When I brought June home, Mom was like, ooh, yes, that's good, But anyway, they were prearranged marriages. Today, we marry very differently, and I've got to be honest, I don't think we're any better than our parents used to be. I mean, let's be honest. How good are we when we're 17, 18, 19, 20, whatever our age is, at picking out someone to spend the rest of our lives with? I mean, how do we make those decisions? And that becomes a big issue in this particular text. If you go back to Deuteronomy 7, Moses is warning them, when God brings you into the land, he's going to drive out the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and then you have the command, do not intermarry with them. Don't do it. Now, you quickly notice that among the tribes here, the Moabites are not listed, and they're not. But if you read on in Deuteronomy, and I've got the wrong text up here, so I'm going to correct it. This is not Deuteronomy 7. This is Deuteronomy 23. Okay? And so if you go to Deuteronomy 23, here's what Moses says about the Ammonites and the Moabites. Now, the Ammonites and Moabites are Israelite cousins. Okay? Ammon and Moab were the sons of Lot, Abraham's nephew. And so these are very distant cousins. Now, when I say distant, I mean major distant. I don't know how many of y'all have done ancestry, DNA? Anybody? Handful of you? I'm a genealogist, and so I sent in my DNA a long time ago. Y'all, I have got like 5,000 cousins that's been identified through DNA. And I look and I see, okay, now how am I a cousin to this person? And boy, when I go, I share the same fifth great-grandfather. Well, we may be cousins, but we ain't cousins much, right? And that was the way with the Ammonites and the Moabites. They were cousins from the family of, Abraham's dad, Terah, but they had gone off and followed other gods. And so no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly. The assembly here is worship. And basically Moses says, listen, don't let them in. And by the way, one of the reasons was when they came up out of Israel, the Moabites, they're the ones that hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. Their own cousins trying to get someone to curse them. And so Moses says, listen, they cannot come and worship with you. Not only that, do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. Now, I don't know about you, but if marriage can be called anything, it should be a treaty of friendship. And so while the text doesn't say do not marry Moabites, it says don't make a treaty of friendship with them, and it probably pushes that over into that category. Going back to chapter 7, do not intermarry with them. Why? For they will turn your children away from following me to serving other gods. That was always God's concern. Now you got to understand something here. We're not talking about the difference between, let's say, my mom and dad. My mom and mom had grown up. When I asked Mom, I said, what did you grow up religiously? And Mom said, well, I grew up Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Church of Christ, Pentecostal. I said, okay. Mom said, I just went to church with my friends, and so wherever my current friends were, that's where I went to church. My dad, on the other hand, grew up in Churches of Christ. And when they got married, neither one of them were Christians. And I look back and I think, boy, God's grace was at work through that, because shortly after they got married, they both became Christians. But we're not talking about people who grow up, in groups of people who claim allegiance to Jesus. We're talking about pagan groups. We're talking about groups that were horrendous. When you go back and you look at, for instance, the god Molech. one of the ways you worship Molech was literally take your child that has just been born to you and offer it as a sacrifice to Molech as a god. I mean, these people were incredibly wicked. And God knew that if you intermarried with them, everything he had done at Sinai, the covenant that he had entered into with Israel, all of it would be in vain. And so there's the prohibition. Talking about the god of the Moabites. Here's what happened to Solomon. Solomon, violated God's commandment. He intermarried with all these people. And as a result of that, his heart was taken away from the Lord. I will do this because they have forsaken me. And they worshiped Ashtoreth and the goddess of the Sidonian, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. That would have been the god of Ruth and Orpah. And Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and have not walked in obedience to me. And so you have God saying to them, don't intermarry. Why? Because it's going to lead you astray. And we shouldn't be surprised when you get to the New Testament. You find Paul basically saying the same thing. Now, this is not specifically about marriage, but it definitely applies to marriage. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. I mean, Paul's talking here. He's not saying don't be friends with unbelievers. We've got to be friends with unbelievers. But he's saying be careful, those of you in business, from becoming partners with someone who has no regards to God whatsoever. Be careful on that. Because it can draw you away. It can compromise your values. When you're getting married, be careful that you don't take someone who doesn't believe in God and marry someone who does believe in God. In fact, when you get over to 1 Corinthians 7, he's talking about widows in particular. And he says a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes. But then look what Paul says. But he must belong to the Lord. He's got to be a follower of Jesus. And in that ancient world where oftentimes women had very few rights, Paul's concern is if you're a Christian woman, don't marry someone that's not a believer in Jesus because of your lack of rights, it may just literally pull you away from Jesus. I've done a lot of premarital counseling in my days. John Micah has, Brian Shepherd has. And one of the things you figure out doing premarital counseling is that you quickly realize that some people shouldn't get married. Even if they both believe in God, even if both go to church, sometimes even then, you're like, ugh. Now, I know as a counselor, the last thing you ought to be doing, Brian, is telling somebody that they should or should not get married. Maybe you should, but, I try to stay away from that. But on 2 occasions, Brian, I've told people, don't get married. And guess what? They got married. And I remember one guy that came up to me and asked me if he would marry him and his fiancée, and I said, no, I'm not marrying you. I knew him. I knew him well. And he said, why? And I said, because you won't make it. And he said, well, will you at least do my premarital counseling? And I'm like, I'll do your premarital counseling, but I'm telling you, I'm not performing the wedding ceremony. I can't do that to myself. And so this couple got married, they had a child, and 5 years later, he's standing in the church building looking at me going, how'd you know? And I said, how would anybody not know? I mean, it was so obvious. Y'all did not need to marry each other. And they went their separate ways. Folks, your value system needs to be a value system that matches the person you're marrying. If you're a committed follower to Jesus Christ, the biggest mistake you can make is to be yoked with someone who is not. Now, is it sinful? No, I'm not saying it's sinful. This is wisdom material. And of course, I tell people all the time, neither my mom or dad were Christians when they got married. And yet they made the same decision on the same night to follow Jesus Christ, for which I'm eternally grateful. But what if they had not? What would my life have been like? And so we need to seriously think about this, as they should have, but then didn't. And then notice what happens. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Here's the tragedy continuing. How long were they married? We don't know. We know, however, it wasn't long enough to have children, or else God intervened so that they wouldn't have children. But now the 2 sons die, and Naomi is left with her 2 daughter-in-laws. And boy, you think about that situation in the ancient world. again, we live in a different world today. You know, it's kind of like my grandmother years and years and years ago. My grandmother and granddad were married over 60 years. Grandmother was 14 when she got married. Okay? Had my dad a week before she turned 15. Granddaddy was 17. And I sat down as grandmother was nearing the end of her life, and I'm just asking her all these questions about herself. And I said, Grandmother, did you ever once think about divorcing Granddaddy? And she said, and do what? She said, back in my day, you couldn't go and get a job at Walmart. I mean, there was nobody who would hire you. Why would I divorce your granddad? You know. And I think that was the way it was in the ancient world. And so here are these three women now left by themselves. And so Naomi hears that the famine has finally broke in back home in Judea. And so she and her daughter-in-law is prepared to return home from there. But what you find very quickly is that Naomi is thinking through this process. And as she thinks through the process, she makes a decision. Then Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, go back, each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord, may Yahweh, pronounces a blessing in the name of the God of Israel. May the Lord show you kindness. If you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me, may the Lord, once again, grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Jim had been married just a couple years. He and his wife welcomed their first son. But about a year after their son was was born, Jim's wife came down with a sickness that doctors couldn't figure out, and then suddenly died, leaving Jim with a 1-year-old child as a sole parent, grieving for his wife and his son's mother. About a year passed, and Jim's telling me the story. He said, my father-in-law came to see me. And father-in-law came in and said, Jim, I know you're missing your wife, just like we miss our daughter. But you need to hear me very carefully. Your son needs a mother. It's time that you move on. You'll not dishonor our daughter by marrying someone else. And I'm asking you for the sake of our grandson to do that. And Jim told me that's what he needed. What he needed to hear to be able to say, it's time to move on. And he did. And he married a wonderful lady who became a wonderful mother to his son. In so many ways, that's exactly what Naomi is doing. It's time, girls, to move on. She was more concerned about her daughter-in-laws than she was about herself. I mean, you think about that. If they leave her, here is a woman, probably in her mid-40s, who is now left by herself in a foreign country, traveling all the way back through, uncharted territory to Judea. And yet she was willing to do it because she loved her daughter-in-laws that much. She knew how difficult it would have been for them. Moabites going to live in Israel. People who had been Israel's enemy now living amongst them. And then, how would the people in Bethlehem responded? And so she was concerned about them. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept alone and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, no, you return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. How many of you have got to the point where you say, I'm too old to do such and such? Any of y'all done that beside me? By the way, about 5 years ago, I got on top of my house to blow the leaves off. I'd done that every year for years and years and years. Only problem is, about 5 years ago, I got up on top, had my blower, went to stand up, and I couldn't stand up. You're like, why? I was scared to death. I mean, I eased back down, and I said, okay, I'm too old to climb up on and walk on top of roofs. And about 2 hours later, I climbed down off that roof. I'm serious, y'all. I'm inching down that roof thinking, I am going to fall off this thing. And then June will be able to remarry and get all that insurance money. And And so last year, my son came in, my youngest son. I said, I need the leaves blowed off. And he said, okay. And he got up and he blew off the leaves. And he came down and said, Dad, that's the last year for me. And I'm like, oh. Sometimes you get too old to do certain things. She said, I'm too old to marry again. Blending two families is not always easy. And Naomi knew that. Taking these daughter-in-laws back, it's going to be hard. And so she told them, you need to go back home. Following Philippians chapter 2, do nothing out of selfish ambition, vain conceit. In humility, value others above yourselves. That's exactly what Naomi was doing. She wasn't looking out after her interests. She was looking out after the interests of her two daughter-in-laws. It is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand is turned against me. You see, you get down now into that hardship, that kind of book of Job. If you remember the book of Job, that's the way Job felt. Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser, by the way, his accuser is God, at least in his mind. Let my accuser put his indictment in writing. And in so many ways, Naomi's feeling the same thing. God, for some reason, is against me. I don't know why, but he is. And yet I think Naomi and Job both got it right. You know, Job said this, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. The easy translations literally says, even if God kills me, I'll still trust him. And Naomi trusted him. Not understanding why, but trusting him to be the one true God. And sometimes it looks like even God is against us, but we need to remember he's not. I love this passage out of Psalms. The Lord is on my side, I'll not fear. What can men do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. And yet if you read the rest of the Psalms, oftentimes the psalmist himself says, God, where are you? And so you have this sense of distance sometimes. And yet in the background is always this confidence that God is on our side. And so with this, they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. I love this passage here. He clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people, to her gods. Go back with her. And what follows is the most quoted passage in the book of Ruth. And it's a precious passage to me. Because 45 years ago, on May the 13th, 1979, June and I stood in a church building, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and June quoted these words. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Now, in this case, it was between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. In my case, it was between my wife-to-be. And the worst part is, the preacher nor June told me they were doing that. I just made my vows. And then the preacher turned to June and said, quote. And I thought, what does that mean? And then June started quoting this, and I almost said, would you stop and let the preacher do this? That close? Because I had no clue what they were doing until I realized what she was quoting. One of the most amazing commitments of a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law or any loved one to the other person. And boy, that's exactly what Naomi needed, that encouragement. 1 Thessalonians, you get multiple texts in here. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Sometimes we need that pick-me-up. Chapter 5, verse 11. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you're doing. Chapter 5, verse 14. And we urge you, brothers and sisters, encourage the disheartening. And that's exactly what the words of Ruth did to Naomi. And off they went. So the two went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women explained, can this be Naomi? Now, by the way, do you notice who's absent? They don't even see Ruth. They see Naomi. And could this be Naomi? I mean, have you ever seen someone who you haven't seen in 10, 12 years, and you don't have a clue who they are? I was over at the Red Rooster last Friday morning, and a guy walks up to me, and I could tell he knew me, and I stood up to, shake his hand, and he said, "You don't know who I am, do you?" And I said, "I don't." And then he told me who he was, and I said, "You got to be kidding me." Hadn't seen him in 20 years. I mean, didn't recognize him. But as soon as he told me who he was, I'm like, "Oh, man, alive. It's been so long." That's the way they were. Could this be Naomi? And yet, what Naomi does is describe where she's at. Don't call me Naomi. By the way, Naomi means pleasant. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. Because Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. And one of the things we all know, if we live long enough in this world, is life can be incredibly bitter. I mean, there are moments that we're just, literally crying our eyes out, going, "God, why?" And like I said, if you're old enough, I've been there I don't know how many times. Literally falling to the floor, weeping. Just sitting down in disbelief. What do you mean, the news that just came in? We all experience this sometime. But I love the way chapter 1 ends. Watch how it ends. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And whether you realize it or not, there is where it begins the good news. And if you want to know what that is, you'll have to come back next week. All right. Ruth experienced many of the things that we experience. Naomi experienced many of the things we experienced. And oftentimes got almost to the edge of saying, "God, I just don't get it. Why?" And yet she continued to trust Him. And that's what God calls upon all of us. Continue to trust. And then for some, you may be like Ruth, who had not been raised with the God of Israel. And yet through her mother-in-law, she saw something that she just thought, "I want to be a part of whoever these people are because of the way my mother-in-law's treated me." And she became one who said, "Your God will now be my God." If you'd like to make Jesus Christ the Lord of your life, we're here to help you. You can come right now if you'd like to, as together we stand and sing.